So I am Dr. Eric Beery from the University of California at San Diego. I'm one of the program committee for this year's conference, and I'm so honored by Dr. Hammeroff to be able to be part of the conference here. And I had the great fortune of being able to chair the session this morning on language and consciousness. So our first speaker is Dr. Thomas Bever from the University of Arizona, who has many department and cross-affiliations, including psychology, linguistics, cognitive science, and neurosciences, as well as other centers at the University of Arizona. And he's going to speak to us this morning on 3 aspects of unconscious processing in language and its normal use. Dr. Bever.
Well, there it is. My goal is a little bit different from a number of the lectures that I've attended at the conference, which are bold, adventurous, energetic, and imaginative, namely trying to develop general theories of what consciousness is, or, well, basically what consciousness is. I think that's intriguing and interesting and may guide us to develop what Roger Penrose said we need, which is a new kind of theory to understand what consciousness is. My role, at least as I'm talking about it today, is to use experimental methods and conceptual methods of investigation of language to develop as many facts as we can, not random, but facts that are systematically related to the structure of language and language behavior, to provide boundary conditions, information, constraints, hints as to how consciousness works when it's sort of in vivo. And the advantage that we have with respect to using language for this is that over the last 60 years or so, 70 years, a rich, multifaceted theory of what language is has at least been winnowed, if not fully developed, because of course as a theory it probably will never be fully developed. But it gives us many tools and handles to look at and to consider the relationship between language knowledge, language behavior, and at least intuitively what we think of as consciousness. And so today I'm going to go through 3 of those facets of language and suggest some experimental paradigms that either are in progress or ought to be in progress or will be in progress that can relate those aspects of language to the study of consciousness one way or another. So one question is about the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious computations, unconscious computations that go into the structure of language, conscious introspection, which is one of the tools, of course, that linguists heavily rely on, about the structure of your language, the meaning of individual sentences, entailments between sentences, sentences that are slightly ungrammatical but comprehensible, and so on. Another question is whether variations in consciousness, awareness of the world, and I'm going to be rather loose in my terminology with respect to that, is modality specific, that is to say whether each modality has its own universe of consciousness, or whether there is, at least when we look at it from the standpoint of behavior, basically a global, what happened? Somebody talked, some internet talked. And so I'll be discussing that. In particular, speech, listening to language actually controls, in some sense, your attentional devotion to either external or internal processing. And the question is whether that is actually cuts across all modalities, as a general constraint or whether it's specific to each modality. And finally, I think most interesting with respect to the standpoint of new research is some demonstrations that during sentence comprehension, we are really constructing, sometimes ex post facto, a representation of what we perceive phenomenologically as a continuous experience. And that leads to both studies as to what the unit is of this discontinuous experience, but also opens up some very intriguing ideas about using current brain imaging techniques to actually probe the difference between a point at which incomprehensible information is presented and a somewhat later point, of speech input is presented, and a somewhat later point when what you hear actually clarifies the entire sequence. And the question is, what happens at that point of clarification? So first is the fact that superficially, or sort of not so superficially from the standpoint of linguists, we are capable of making many judgments of different kinds about sentences, particularly about grammaticality, independent of meaning, and the well-known sentence now, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, is a well-known example of a sentence that you can recognize is a grammatical sentence of English, contrast with green furiously sleep ideas colorless, has the same words, but you know that the first one somehow is a sentence and the second one isn't. But the first one doesn't mean very much, although that sentence has sparked a cottage industry of poetry and various other devices to try to show that it really does mean something. And of course, it really can mean something if you stretch it enough. Another case is the third one there, no eye injury is too small to ignore. You all know what that means, but you're wrong. It means actually the opposite of what you think it means, and yet you will insist that what it means is you got to pay attention to every eye injury, no matter how small. But that isn't what it means. I won't go through it. Finally, judgments can get subtle. So a sentence, more people went to China last year than I did. At first, sounds like a great sentence, right? And you say, oh yeah. And then you think about it, ask yourself, what does that really mean? Well, you may decide that it means the second one there, but it doesn't. In fact, it doesn't mean anything. And yet, the fact that at first you think it's a sentence is quite telling to us about the nature of sentence comprehension. What it really depends on is the extent to which the first of those two sentences fits superficial schemata that we all apply to language input as it first comes in at us, and it fits it beautifully, and then suddenly you realize that it doesn't compute further than just the superficiality. So these are kinds of judgments and many other kinds of judgments that we can make about language based on our knowledge of language. And the question is, what's going on with respect to the structure of the language? Traditionally, going back more than 100 years, Wilhelm Wundt, among others, summarized the continental ideas at that time about the structure of language, and he suggested that he suggested that the sentence is the unit of language, and furthermore that you can't really tell what a sentence is objectively. You have to refer to intuitions of native speakers, a rather modern idea. And he proposed or developed the frequently noted idea that sentences have an inner form and an outer form. So all those sentences under the outer form, Caesar crossed the Rubicon was crossed by Caesar, and so on, being a good classical scholar, that was his example. And all of those and more share an inner form, which is that Caesar was in some sense the agent, crossing was the predicate, and Rubicon was what today is called the patient or the direct object. They all share that, and then the question is, when you know a language, how do you know how to relate inner forms to outer forms? So let's look a little bit at today's syntactic models to see what they look like. So this is about a 10-year-old or 15-year-old variant of syntax. Syntax is a living animal that just illustrates that one of the basic properties, let's see, this is the inner form, so-called, and then there's a set of rules that map it onto the outer form. This is for the sentence, Mary was chosen. But now what I'd like to show you is the more recent variant of syntactic analysis, which builds hierarchical phrases, and there are little sound effects that go with it, if it's going to work. Okay, that's building a structure. You'll see the structure getting built. This is when some new word or element comes in. That's when you get agreement between one constituent and another. And that's when you're about to move something from one place to another. This all goes back to a special book I had when I was a kid that was at least attributed to Bozo the Clown. And every time you heard a particular noise, you were supposed to turn the page over. It was a recording. Supposed to turn the page over and go to the next one. And that has imprinted me on how to present these sorts of things. So here we go. This is from a colleague and former student of mine who developed this demonstration with me. This is what the derivation looks like, building a structure for the simple sentence in Spanish, the boy arrived. First, we start with just a collection of words. Then you start to build the structure, I hope. Not working. Okay, that's agreement. There's a new element, building the tree, labeling the tree, a new element, building the tree some more, building the tree a little bit more. And now, critically, we've got to start to move things around. And so the verb moves towards the middle. And there are various agreement properties which have to occur, agreement processes. More elements get added to basically be filled eventually by the Nino. That's just building up the features. Finally, Nino moves to the front, and we get the sentence, I think, with great joy. However, that's the outer form of the sentence. Now we have to do further analysis to get to the inner form, namely the logical form where the basic thematic relations are represented. And now we have that. And then finally it goes to spell out where the sentence is pronounced. Of course, all of this goes faster, and I'll show you at least, we hope it goes faster, and I'll show you an example now of how this goes at least as fast as PowerPoint will allow me to present it. Start with the collection of words. Again, here we go. And then it's to go to the meaning, logical form.
El niño llegó.
Okay, so this is obviously fanciful, but actually it does instantiate the kinds of operations that are proposed within syntactic theory. And the point is that all of that stuff, all of those operations, are not directly accessible. The argument that they are present computationally follows from the fact that they describe the data that we get from introspection fairly well. And that, of course, then raises a question for us about the nature of the introspective process in relation to the theory of what is unconscious. This kind of theory gives us a tool at least to explore that relation. I won't be able to go through it today, but some of the examples of how that's done, and what we can learn from it. But the point is that it is an example of how we can explore the relationship between overt intuitions and underlying unconscious processes that we postulate as underlying those intuitions. The next question, which I'll go through very quickly, has to do with whether, from the behavioral standpoint, remember my method here is to use explorations of language to provide information about how consciousness is enacted using the structure of language and of language behavior as we can understand it experimentally as a tool to give us information that can bear on and potentially constrain theories that we might develop of what consciousness is. And so here the question is whether there is a global consciousness that puts everything together in some sense all at once, or whether there are differentiated, separable consciousnesses. And a way to look at that with using language as the tool is offered by the phenomenon that when we listen to language, or read it, but I'm talking about listening here, the goal is not to become aware of all of that computational stuff that I presented earlier, but simply to immediately map the sounds that you're hearing, in the case of spoken language, onto a meaning. And as you listen to me talk, I want you to think a little bit about how fast that goes and about how, in fact, you believe, at least you probably believe, I think, that in general, you are actually interpreting what I'm saying as you hear the acoustic input. And that's something we'll come back to, because that's the goal of comprehension. To do it, logically at any rate, you can see requires building up units of speech input that provide enough information so that they actually cohere and can be mapped onto some at least partial meaning. And so, for example, a very clear example of that is the end of a sentence. Sentences are major chunks of input that have sufficient information to interpret them and to integrate them with your prior knowledge and with whatever the ongoing discourse is. So the question is, how do these chunks affect your awareness or consciousness of other modalities? And the fact is, a number of experiments that have shown over the years that at the ends of such units, right at the end of such units, or after them, right after them, basically you are inattentive for about 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, to various other kinds of input, external input. So brief clicks that you're supposed to detect are frequently missed. Light flashes are missed if your task is to detect a light flash. Your ability to make discriminations of various kinds that are presented at that point are you either make errors or you take much longer. Even brain imaging techniques show that the brain reflectively, as you would expect, shows less response to various other kinds of stimuli, while at the ends of these major units where you're mapping the sound sequence onto the meaning. And so notice that the competition between your language processing and the input is not the competition necessarily between two kinds of sensory motor information. That would not be so surprising. What's of great interest is that what's competing with what here is your internal processing, your mapping of the meaning onto your prior knowledge and the discourse structure is in itself internal to you, but it is interfering with your ability to sense or be aware of a variety of kinds of externally presented sensory stimuli. And this actually raises the question, allows us to study the question now, as to whether this kind of alternation of external versus internal, external attention or consciousness versus internal processing is a general process or whether it is modality specific. And so Wundt's view about these things was that it was a general process, a general oscillation between external and internal processing, but that remains to be seen. The point is that it becomes a question that we can ask, and we can use language and experimental investigations of language as a tool to study this question, to give us more information about the nature of how consciousness works, hopefully to constrain theories in the future of what consciousness is. Finally, most interesting, I think, or most interesting to me because it was a more relatively recent discovery for me, is the fact that while we believe that we are mapping the meaning onto the acoustic input as we hear it, I'm going to show you some demonstrations that this is not the case, that in fact there is a reconstructive aspect in many instances in which material, acoustic material that comes later, is absolutely necessary in order to interpret mangled acoustic material that has come earlier, but you have no sense of that. Your sense is that you interpreted the meaning as you heard the sounds, and the meaning and the lexical structure and so on, as the sounds came in, not subsequently by a fifth of a second or half a second, as the case may be. So I'm going to present some demonstrations of this. For those of you who are not native speakers of English, I apologize because this may not work very well as an example, as a demonstration, but let's see. So the major point is well known, but has not been really attended to very much with respect to normal conversation, or even the way I'm talking now, which is not normal, but it's not totally abnormal. It's not laboratory speech. And the phenomenon is that a great deal of what we hear, that is to say what we think we hear, isn't there. It's reconstructed at the outset. Phonemes are mangled, they're deleted, and as we'll see, whole words or even several words at a time can be basically deleted with just a wisp of a trace as to, acoustically, as to whether they were there or not. So what I'm going to do is first play you a snippet from conversation. This is research carried out by my colleague, Natasha Warner, who studies people who are engaging in normal conversation with each other, as opposed to using laboratory speech to test comprehension and so on. And I hope this will let me do this. Let me see here. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so here's a snippet of a conversation. Oops, sorry. Where are we? Here we are. Come on.
Planted.
Okay, got any ideas as to what that is?
Planted.
It's 4 words. Okay, and here it is in the context of the utterance.
But either way, I can't register in person, so they're just going to have to deal with that.
So they're just going to have to deal with that. The that you heard initially is actually interpreted when you hear it in the context as gonna have to. Let me play it again.
But either way, I can't register in person, so they're just going to have to deal with that.
You hear the gonna have to? That's the thing you heard first. Here's another example, which when I'm in Arizona, I refer to get people to think about it. I say, think of Southern California. Okay, think of Southern California as you hear this. Although not Southern California today.
Shown in
Any ideas? All right, well, okay, here's the larger sentence.
or Tuesday night when we were chilling in the spa, but
You get it? Try it again.
or Tuesday night when we were chilling in the spa, but
It's chilling in them. Chilling in them is what you were hearing initially. And what's interesting about this, in fact, about both of these, well, especially this case, actually.
or Tuesday night when we were chilling in the spa, but
Now notice, when you hear chilling in the, incomprehensible. But when you hear in the spa, what follows it, it becomes immediately comprehensible. And it's a phenomenological question, but I don't think that I, at any rate, have the intuition that there was this fuzzy thing I didn't understand and then it popped into consciousness. My intuition is I got it as I heard it. And there we are, with the text.
or Tuesday night when we were chilling in the spa, but
Okay, now here's another example. This is going to be another example where following context clarifies what you're hearing initially. Oops, oh, rats, gave it away.
You have time. You have time. You have time.
Okay, that's 4 words. And here it is in context.
Do you have time to talk to me for a little while?
Okay, do you have time to, is what the fragment was. Again, the moral here is that, the important point is that initially you can't, the first 300, 400 milliseconds, which have compressed 4 words into them, is not comprehensible by itself. What are the implications of that? It becomes comprehensible immediately as with the following material presented to you. Well, the point is that I'm not going to talk about it. I'll just say that kids are presented with the same puzzle, which magnifies for us in thinking about the so-called poverty of the stimulus. When linguists analyze the kind of input that kids get to show that they must have a lot of innate apparatus to actually figure the syntax out of their languages, they generally suppose that the words are clearly presented to the kid. And the kid's problem is to figure out the syntactic rules that govern the relationship between the words and where the words should be and so on. But it's worse than that from the standpoint of the kid. These are normal, so-called motherese sometimes exaggerates the intonation pattern, but it's my view that kids don't care very much about motherese anyway. They care about what the adults are saying to each other because that's what really affects their life. But that's another story. So the point is that, if I'm right, that the conscious experience of language in which we believe we are understanding the meaning and the words and everything in between as we hear it can't be right. And what that shows us is that in part what's going on is that we are reconstructing backward in time the conscious experience that we seem to think we are experiencing in time. And I think that's a really astounding fact, a useful fact. I don't think it's a total surprise for people who think about consciousness and how we put together a stable world, for example, from multiple snapshots. As I look around the room, you do not jump around, you're all very stable. And that's another example of how serial processes, serial input can be put together into a single representation. So it's not that it should be so surprising to people who think about consciousness. It's just that in the case of language, we now have a very clear tool and a clear way of exploring this phenomenon and even looking at its brain, the implications for brain processing through brain imaging of various kinds and so on. So new experimental programs that emerge from the considerations that I've raised, really, from this consideration, come in 2 sorts. The first question that one could ask, especially if one's a linguist, the kind of question that linguists ask, is what is the unit of this that embraces the potential for backward processing? Is it definable in behavioral terms, for example, as a function of intonation patterns, or a speech rate change, slowing down, speeding up at certain points, or simply the surface phrase structure as linguists would define it, variations in the ongoing predictability of one sound after another, one word after another, or whether in fact it's a reflection of certain kinds of stages in the building up of a structure of a sentence and of language. These are structural questions that can be investigated now with respect to this issue, and there are experimental methods. We're not dependent on simply collecting masses of conversations and then doing after-the-fact analysis. We can design materials with malice aforethought that will vary specifically the particular kinds of units that we're trying to probe for. Another aspect of this is indeed to use these phenomena as a tool to differentiate different stages of processing that may be reflected in characteristically different brain states and brain activity. So, for example, do you have time or chillin'? Not that we would use those examples, we would use constructed examples, but with respect to what I've presented, we can analyze with various tools, EEG, MEG, even TMS to interfere with what's going on at certain points. We could examine the neurological behavior, the brain behavior, at the initial thing, tuvtai, and then later when we know behaviorally that it pops into consciousness, to talk to me. And so we can look at those two different times and also the ramp between them and so on to explore what may be characteristically going on at the point where we know behaviorally that there's some retrospective processing that is bringing everything into what seems phenomenologically to be a continuous stream of relating what you're hearing to what you're understanding. My suspicion is that it won't appear in difference in location of activities in the brain, but rather probably more with respect to phase differences and also oscillation, differences in different frequencies of oscillation. But that's just a hunch. I mean, the question is there a unique brain signature coincident with the point of reconstructing what you've heard? So, to summarize, as I mentioned, I admire greatly the efforts of many people here to develop a general theory of what consciousness is. As I said, my role in this, at least in this discussion, is to try to use language and what we know about language to adduce additional facts that can help us constrain possible theories and the relationship about consciousness and its relationship to behavior in the brain. Language is very complex. It offers us a lot of tools to use for various kinds of integrated observations. I've presented you with 3 examples. One is the possibility of actually really intensely studying the introspective process, the relationship between conscious and unconscious knowledge. The next question has to do potentially with exploring how consciousness is fractionated, if it is, variation in consciousness being modality specific or being general. And finally, and I think most intriguing to me right now, is the question of the extent to which the conscious experience of mapping the meaning of sentences onto their sound is reactive, that is to say it occurs right as we hear it, and the extent to which there's evidence that it's actually reconstructed after the fact, despite the fact that that does not correspond to our phenomenology. And this raises a number of questions, both about what the units are within which this backward processing can occur, and also the question of the nature of the brain responses to it. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bever. I'll invoke the chair privilege and take the first question, while we maybe will have take a couple of questions if you want to come to the microphones. We'll just have a few minutes for questions. So you're invoking this possibility that there are multiple consciousnesses, or at least modes or modules in them, and you've already talked about 2 of them, which is the constructive one to create language outputs, and then of course the speech interpretation. Do you have a thought as to those 2 modules themselves, how they are linked, and do they intersect, or are they distinct or globally connected?
I did not plant this question. Let me just say that there's a very interesting issue, which is what kind of dynamic drives the child to develop an abstract representation of language that we know of as the kind of constructive grammar that I presented in the cartoon. One idea is that the child is learning simultaneously two kinds of behavior which are not initially well connected to each other. One is the ability to talk, to get ideas across verbally, and the other is the ability to understand. We all take it for granted that children can understand things that they can't say. But actually, very interestingly, there are instances that show us that there are things that children can say and do say that are at least interpretable by adults, but that they do not understand themselves if somebody says it to them. And what that tells us is that at some points during childhood, there are actually different units, different modes, different kinds of processes which are not entirely well integrated. And one of the ideas about how an intrinsic motive, kind of in the Piagetian mode for those of you who are over the age of 50, is to create an internal kind of cognitive consistency between the two modes of speaking, learning to speak and learning to understand. And what a grammar does actually is to give you a representation of what you know, independent of how you behave with what you know.
Wow. Hand up for a question. Anybody? Down back there?
Is there a microphone for it?
They're bringing a microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll take the one right here first. Go ahead.
So I have a question about the reactive versus constructive processes you mentioned. In reflecting on what Roger Penrose said yesterday, he was speaking about mathematical understanding in a way that sounded reactive, in the sense of when we understand the truth of a mathematical proposition, that understanding is somehow non-computable, and yet it seems that there might be a perspective where in order to have the understanding of the truth of a mathematical proposition, you would have to have some internal computations and mapping going on. So I'm wondering how you might think about this.
Well, what comes to mind is models of problem solving themselves in which the solution to a problem classically, by classically I mean from the Gestalt world, where they gave a lot of attention to problem solving, that solving a problem or thinking you've solved it elicits a so-called moment of insight, the so-called aha reaction. And I might interpret what you're saying is that the moment where you recognize that the proof worked is the moment where where you have solved the implicit problem, not necessarily an explicit problem, but an implicit mental problem that elicits that reaction. But it has to be eliciting a reaction to a chain of steps, as I think what you were asking about, that the instant of apperception that something great has happened and this is a proof that works, is actually integrating a series of steps. You're not just thinking that next to last step plus last step did it all. You're pulling together a chain, a computational chain, in one instance. And in that sense, I guess you could interpret that as reactive.
But would that be
I'm sorry,
computational?
as reconstructive, I'm sorry.
But that would be the outcome of a computational process rather than
Right.
some moment of non-computable.
Yeah, I mean, that's as much as I can say about that.
One more question?
But thank you, that's a good question.
Thank you for your wonderful and stimulating presentation. As may become clear from my question, I'm not a linguist.
Oh, that's okay.
So my question concerns how it is that we're able to speak about consciousness at all.
Can you understand him?
How we're able to speak about consciousness. So in a naive model of language, we form the semantic reference by contrasts within conscious experience. So red and green are from contrasting experiences. So if that's how we form semantic references, how do we form a semantic reference of consciousness? Because we never have an experience of being unconscious. So I mean, I have some ideas about that, and I'm sure many people do, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we construct language around consciousness itself.
Please interpret.
So just
I'm sorry, the speaker was so loud I couldn't really understand what you're saying.
it's directed the wrong way for us.
A paradox
so the
in its
question
own
is,
case.
since we don't actually have a semantic reference for consciousness itself, how can we speak about consciousness in contrast to, say, a color experience?
Are you suggesting we got to have a word for it? I don't understand.
Can you hear me now?
I'm sorry?
Try again.
Okay. So when I form the semantic references for color words, it seems to me I use my conscious experience of colors to form those reference. So when I use the word consciousness, it seems to me if the meaning of that word is formed in the same way, I would need to have a contrast within consciousness of consciousness and unconsciousness, but that seems to be a contradiction.
So how can we talk about consciousness as an item itself, as a quality, because we only experience consciousness and we don't really experience unconsciousness?
Well, that's what theories are for. To tell you what, I mean, to make a claim about what the unconscious is that may correspond in some interesting and articulated way to what we feel is conscious. I mean, that to a great extent is what I've been talking about. So it's a theoretical enterprise. All that stuff that I presented as a model of how sentences are constructed, we don't see any of that. What we see is the result of that, and we make inferences by looking at sentences that are differentiated behaviorally one way or another in terms of our introspection to tell us what kinds of internal structures and internal processes might explain the external phenomenology that we are in fact aware of. But it's a theory. It's like little particles or tubules or, pick your tiny thing, except this is a mental thing that we are proposing in the hopes, of course, someday that we'll understand in some sense the mechanistic or physical basis for what it is. But we've got to start first with an articulated theory of the unconscious processes. So I agree with you. We don't directly perceive those processes. That's part of the issue.
Thank you very much. And thank you for staying on time.
Okay.
And so now carrying on, Dr. Bever pointed out that we have an interesting genealogy of cognitive linguists here with us in our session this morning. So, of course, we're all anxious for the discussion from our eminent father of this process, Dr. Chomsky. Dr. Bever was Dr. Chomsky's graduate student, and he spawned a graduate student, Dr. Tannenbaum, and our next speaker is the student of Dr. Tannenbaum. So he's the great-grandchild graduate student of Professor Chomsky. And do we have, Dr. Michael Spivey is visiting us from our sister campus, the University of California at Merced. And he's in the departments of cognitive and information sciences there at UC Merced. And he's going to speak to us about language, consciousness, and embodied cognition. Dr. Spivey.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Tom Bever and Stuart Hameroff for including me in this illustrious panel with my academic grandparents and great-grandparent. What I want to talk about today is how language and embodied cognition have a way of spreading consciousness across different mediums of matter, from a brain to a body to its environment, and even perhaps to other brains. So I'm going to walk through a handful of examples here of scientific observations that might encourage you to expand the circle of matter that you define as what makes you conscious or what makes you who you are. And each little scientific observation just might convince you to make one more incremental expansion until you get wider than you might have expected. So we'll start with work from Benjamin Lebet and people following him. I'll talk about how decisions appear to emerge from frontal cortex, not from Descartes' soul. That a few hundred years ago we thought that, or Descartes suggested that a soul that's non-physical talks to your pineal gland and tells neurons to do something, and then those neurons respond. But only a few decades ago, Benjamin Lebet, many of you I'm sure are familiar with this experiment, had people look at a clock face that had a dot going around, and whenever they just freely willed, felt like it, they're going to lift a finger. And the nice thing about the clock is you can keep a visual track of where that dot is, what number it's next to, when you've had that freely willed decision to lift your finger. And he's got EMG recording the actual lifting of the finger, and he's got EEG on the surface of the scalp recording your neural activity. What many of you know Lebet found was that you can identify the point in time during which the finger actually lifts. You can also identify the point in time in which the participant was aware of their plan to lift their finger, and that's a couple hundred milliseconds before the finger lifts. But the EEG pattern showed a few hundred milliseconds before that, there was already a rise in the readiness potential, and that readiness potential is a measure of neural activity in the brain preparing to lift that finger before the person's aware that they're preparing to lift the finger. Essentially, your brain knows what you're about to do before you do. Well, that's about a third of a second before your awareness of that plan to lift a finger. More recently, John Dylan Haynes and colleagues have used fMRI and found an even longer span of time. So they have a letter shown for 500 milliseconds, another letter, 500 milliseconds each letter. That's your clock in this version of the experiment. And people are lying in the fMRI scanner, and whenever they feel like it, they can just lift a finger and press either the left button or the right button. So it's a slightly more complex choice. It's not just lifting your finger, it's making a choice between a left or right button. And what John Dylan Haynes and colleagues found was that in frontal cortex, of course, it's a good 8 seconds before the finger lifts, a good 7 seconds before they report being aware of their plan to press a left or right button, that the fMRI signal in frontal cortex gives them a 60% accurate bet on which button they're going to press. So it's just a 10% bump in accuracy, but it's clearly evidence that there is a signal going on in frontal cortex 7 seconds before the person is aware of their plan to move their finger and press the left or right button, that you can make a good bet on which button they're going to pick based on that pattern of activity in frontal cortex. So your brain knows what you're going to do before you do. That tells us that you should expand that little circle of what is making up who you are, what your consciousness, to something larger than a non-physical soul, to at least include about that much of your frontal cortex. Let's do another step to further expand, not just an individual neuron in the pineal gland, but a group of many neurons, probably in frontal cortex, are the ones that are interacting with one another to generate a freely willed decision, a conscious intention. And in that frontal cortex, you've got those neurons generating that plan, but surrounding that frontal cortex, you've got other brain areas like motor cortex and language areas, Broca's and Wernicke's and visual areas. And what I'm going to show you now is another scientific observation from work by a former postdoc of mine, Gary Lupian, looking at how language areas, frontal and Broca's area, language areas of the brain, can tell vision what to do. There's a bunch of findings like this. This is one that is relatively simple to walk through. People are making a simple detection task. So visual detection of a stimulus being present or not present is something that for a long time people have thought is something that visual cortex does practically all by itself. It just has to detect the presence of a visual stimulus and say whether there was a letter there on one trial or not on another trial. Do many trials. You immediately follow that brief flash of that stimulus with a mask so that there's no iconic memory lingering. So it's the briefest flash of this thing. It's a very difficult task. You say whether there was a letter present or not. That's it. But a few hundred milliseconds before that, you heard over your headphones an audio cue in one condition, like the sound M. And sure enough, that's the letter that winds up being presented on half the trials. But on the other half of those trials where you heard M, you got nothing. So it's a 50-50 guess, if you're guessing. And of course, there are also trials with no cue at all. What Gary Lupian found was that you get an increased sensitivity, D prime. It's not a huge increase, but it's statistically reliable, such that your visual detection of the presence of a stimulus is influenced by that auditory cue a few hundred milliseconds beforehand. Something that you might think the visual cortex is supposed to be able to do all by itself. It's being talked to by language cortices and frontal cortices saying, hey, I think we've got something to help shape the way our receptive fields are taking this input. And sure enough, that gives you an increase in visual sensitivity. Now, there's quite a few findings of these kinds of top-down influences on perception. There's high-level ones like visual context influencing syntactic processing that my advisor, Mike Tannenhaus, demonstrated. There's lower-level demonstrations of attention influencing activity of neurons with single-cell recording in primary visual cortex even. All throughout there, there's these evidence of frontal cortex and frontal areas of the brain sort of shaping the way sensory and motor cortices are preparing their processing of planned output or processing of current input. So the sharing of information back and forth between frontal cortices and sensory and motor cortices is producing a pattern of connectivity in here that probably makes it difficult to, oops, we got a slow response here, probably makes it difficult to talk about the frontal cortex as being a module separated from the rest of the brain. So maybe we should expand that circle that defines where your mental content is to include not just frontal cortex, but your entire brain. So maybe whatever consciousness is, it sort of emerges as an interaction among many, many tiny little elements across your whole brain, not just your frontal cortex. We've made one expansion, and I'm guessing a lot of you are with me on that. Let's continue this expansion and see how many of you can agree with me still. In embodied robotics and an insight called morphological computation, roboticists and AI researchers have come to this realization that the robotic body is actually doing some of your intelligence for you. The morphology of that robot body, the morphology of your human body, is doing some computation in its interface between the brain and the peripheral nervous system and the actual tissues that make up your body. So when roboticists are building robot hands, it took them a long time to figure out that you need to work on the passive compliance of that effector. Without any electricity being involved in the squishiness of those pads on your fingers, the squishiness of the pads on your fingers have a passive compliance. When you reach out and grasp an object, there's a force being applied onto the pads of skin on your fingertips that is a matrix of information squishing against that rigid body in the case of this object, then it's doing equal and opposite matrix of force vectors back onto your finger pads, and that interface is a sharing of information back and forth that's not using neural signals, it's not using electrical signals. Roboticists figured out that when you put some squishy fingertips on that robot, it actually is able to do a much smarter interaction with objects in the world. It's going to have electrical sensors to receive the force feedback on that squished piece of foam fingertip. But the foam shapes itself around an egg, and finally robot hands were able to pick up an egg without crushing it. So this morphological computation is a way to think about not just a brain and a brain stem and a peripheral nervous system producing neural activation patterns from which intelligence can emerge, but the actual skin surrounding that peripheral nervous system is doing some of the same kind of computations. It's a matrix of forces pressing against the surface of that body that has a pattern of information to it, and that pattern of information in that matrix of surface forces is converted into neural or electrical signals with the same kind of information pattern. So this back and forth information transmission between a skin on a robot and an object it's grasping is not that different from the back and forth information going on, back and forth sharing of information going on between frontal cortex and sensory and motor cortices. So morphological computation has been a way that people have started to think about not just a brain, not just a CPU, but actually the robot body you put that CPU in is doing some of your thinking for you. Andy Clark has talked about this kind of way of thinking about how your human body is doing some morphological computation for you. So let's expand that scope one more bit, if you're with me on this one, to include not just a brain stem with its brain and a peripheral nervous system, but also a body. And now we're going to look at a body that has a tool in its hand, not just an object that's grasping like an egg, but in this case, cells in intraparietal cortex that people have recorded directly from, in the case of a monkey, that are bimodal neurons that respond to somatosensory input. So touch on that hand will make this neuron go nuts and produce a bunch of spikes per second. And also purely visual input with no touch happening. Purely visual input that's near that hand will also make that same neuron active. So this is a bimodal neuron. It responds to visual or somatosensory input. And in particular, it's responding to when an object is touching that hand and when an object is near, essentially reachable, graspable by that hand. It's almost, if you're familiar with J.J. Gibson's ecological perception, it's almost like this neuron is kind of coding for an affordance, some object that is reachable, graspable. Now they train this monkey with a tool, like a rake. So now this monkey has a rake that's not just going to be able to grasp a grape that's near his hand and pop it in his mouth. They love doing that. Now he's been trained to grasp a grape that's 2 feet away from him, drag it toward him, and then pop it in its mouth. Now all of a sudden, that very same neuron that had a visual receptive field just barely around the hand has a visual receptive field well beyond the hand. It's as though this neuron, and assumingly the network of neurons in this area, are recoding this monkey's body schema such that it includes the rake as part of its body. The graspability of that grape is now extended to another part of space that is extended only by a non-biological object that's in its hand. So it's rewired his body schema. That rake is being treated as part of its effector system. Part of who this monkey is involves a piece of wood. So these tools in your hand become part of how you do your thinking, part of how you do your mental computations. Maybe they're part of what your consciousness is made of. All right, let's keep moving to expand that scope even further to not just objects you might hold in your hand as being part of the physical material that generates your conscious experience. Let's talk about your visual environment. That could be not 1 or 2 feet away, but 10 or 20 feet away. The late, great Bruce Bridgman was one of the first to really track down, over a few decades of his career, just how unreliable the reafferent signal is for your eye movements. When you make a saccadic eye movement from one location, jump to another location, your brain tries to keep track of what direction that saccade was in and how far it went, but it's not a very reliable signal. If you really were to try to collect all those little snapshots from this fixation, that fixation, that fixation, the metrics that your brain is able to keep track of are sloppy. And so if you had this mosaic of snapshots and tried to piece them together based on the eye movement signals of how far that recent saccade was and where and what direction it was in, it would be a sloppy mosaic. It would be like a quilt sewn together by an 8-year-old. It would be a very inaccurate internal representation of the world. And Kevin O'Regan has pointed this out a couple decades ago with his emphasis on just how inaccurate these eye movement systems are. And that led to the change blindness literature. So many of you have seen this kind of research on change blindness, where you see a relatively complex scene that you can kind of look at and understand all of it, and you feel like, I know, I've got a mental representation of what that scene's about. And then the scene changes to the same photo. Raise your hand without saying anything. Raise your hand if you see the change. Some of you may have seen the picture before, so that's cheating. But those of you who have not seen this change blindness demonstration before, some of you may not realize what is changing in this scene. It's a pretty important piece of this scene that has changed. And a lot of you, I think, still haven't seen it. Raise your hand if you have not seen it. Yeah. So look under the wing that's visible. There's an engine there. And in this other version of that image that you felt like you were seeing the same thing, there's no engine there. That's an important part. You wouldn't want to get on a plane that's missing its engine on one of the wings. So this is a piece of evidence, these kinds of changed blindness findings. It's a huge cottage industry with lots of real-world demonstrations as well, not just static photos, is a pretty strong demonstration that you don't have a complete 3D model in your head of what the visual scene looks like, the way David Marr suggested back in 1980. You have an approximated one, and it's missing a lot of pieces sometimes that you won't even notice. When the scene changes, you should be able to compare that to your internal representation and find that what's been changed, but it's not complete enough for you to be able to make that change. So one way to think about this, according to Kevin O'Regan and others, is that that external world that feels like it's always stable is part of your mental computations, and that's why it feels like it's stable. You rely on that external world to be your visual memory. You have a choppy, sloppy, internal neural memory of that visual experience, but the reason that that visual experience out in the world stays so stable is because usually it doesn't change. People don't, or engines don't disappear in real life instantaneously. So let's zoom out that idea to include the external world as part of your visual memory. And now we've expanded this person out to somebody that we all remember, and I miss him quite a bit. This guy. We've been looking in his brain, and now we can look at his body and in his environment. And he uses this environment as part of his visual memory. Maybe it's part of his mental experience. Maybe it's the physical material that generates his consciousness. The neurons in his brain, the body that has interfaces and morphological computation, a tool in his hand that's an ice cream bar. It's a pretty good tool to have in your hand. And a visual environment that is stable enough to do some of your memory for you. All right, let's keep going, zoom out further. Here's an example of an action perception cycle that cognitive scientists for many decades have kind of ignored, spending more time and energy focusing on how perceptual input is cognitively interpreted, when what they really need to be moving on to now is looking at how motor output is produced as well. Your job as a human being is not just to make a really smart internal representation of the external world. You need to know how to adapt and react to that external world. Those actions are important. And we've talked about some feedback loops from frontal cortices back to sensory and motor cortices, but there's also a feedback loop from those actual actions. The actions you make in the world change the way the sensory input impacts your sensors. Every eye movement you make changes the way the world applies its light pattern into your eyes. Every action you make changes the way the objects in the world impact your sensor system. When you're looking at a metal wire puzzle and trying to figure out how to solve it, you don't just look at it and make an internal representation and perform some mathematical knot theory and mentally rotate it. You think with your hands. You perform some of those cognitive operations out in the world as you fiddle with this thing and try to solve a puzzle by performing some of those cognitive operations out in the world. So some of your thinking is happening out there, not just in here. And a recent example that Philip Parnemitz and Daniel Richardson, one of my grad students, we got a further lineage of great-great-great-grandparenthood. Philip Parnemitz and Daniel Richardson had people look at a computer screen while their eyes were being tracked, and they would hear a sentence, a bunch of different sentences that had been normed in advance to be close to 50-50 on your responses. And a lot of them were moral statements like, murder is sometimes justifiable. And the computer screen would then have an option written on the screen that says sometimes justifiable, or on the right side, never justifiable. And when these sentences are normed in advance, as they were to be about 50-50 in people's responses, you will frequently get people making eye movements back and forth to these two options, because they can't quite decide, do I want to say it's sometimes justifiable, or do I want to say it's never justifiable? The participants in this experiment were in Sweden, and so some of the norming may be specific to Sweden, but this was a 50-50 item that people would look back and forth on. This little diagram is a way to think about how you might spend some period of time in the gray bar there fixating the never justifiable option, and then spend some period of time fixating the sometimes justifiable, and then another period of time fixating back on never justifiable. Those are your eye movement patterns that we can record in the laboratory. And this little wavy bar here is a way to think about what that mind is probably doing, leaning toward one option, so that's why it looks at it, and then lean toward the other option, then it looks at that one. And you'll see people do these back and forth eye movements. The trick here that Philip Parnemetz and Daniel Richardson came up with was not just to follow what the mind might be doing based on what the eyes are doing, but to adjust what the mind winds up saying. So if you catch the mind while the eyes are looking at one particular option, and maybe that's because the mind is leaning in that particular option, and interrupt the trial and say, hey, decide now. Or if the computer instead has pre-chosen the other option, the computer is going to pre-choose an option to tweak you on, and it waits till you look at that other option for a while, and then while you're looking at it, it interrupts the display and says, respond now, press this button or that button, left or right sides. And sure enough, when they've looked at both options at least some amount of time, and then looked at the option that the computer has pre-chosen as the one it wants you to pick, while you're fixating that one, it interrupts and says, respond now. Instead of 50% of the time them choosing that option, it's about 60% of the time that they choose that option. This is not unlike you sitting in a restaurant and you've maybe made a decision that you're going to no longer eat your favorite veal parmigiana because veal is cruel. And so you open up that menu and you look, oh, there's that veal parmigiana, but I've said I'm not going to have that anymore. Move your eyes to the chicken parmigiana. Yeah, that's what I'm going to have, the chicken parmigiana, because I've made a decision, a moral decision for myself, well, a mild one, but an important one. And then your eyes go back to that veal parmigiana, remembering how delicious it is. And that's when the waiter comes up and says, what would you like to order? And you, veal parmigiana? There's your 10% bump due to a simple little interface with the world of if that damn waiter had shown up 1 second earlier or 1 second later, maybe you would have been able to stick to your moral compass that you've inserted inside your brain. But because of your moment-by-moment interactions with the world, subtle little, even moral judgments can be affected by how your world interfaces with you. Part of who you are at the core, your moral decisions, can emerge differently based on that environment. So choose your environments carefully. So now we've expanded it even further, that you've got a scope of physical material that affects who you are, that may be the matter that generates your consciousness, your moral decisions even, that includes smart interfaces, a computer that's trying to trick you, includes tools in your hand, includes the visual environment that's your memory. So we keep expanding the scope to include not just an environment with tools in your hand, but people. Turns out that environment contains other brains and bodies. Maybe that's some of the matter that participates in generating your consciousness as well. John Dylan Haynes, again, with his student Anna Kulin and Alefeld, have put together an experiment where, again, they're going to do EEG in this case. And they're recording the EEG patterns of a person telling an unscripted story for several minutes. And there's a female speaker, they got the EEG patterns, they got the auditory speech recorded, and they got a male speaker telling a totally different story, unscripted, natural, lots of dropped consonants and squished together words like Tom Bever was describing in this. And they got his EEG trained for that several minute story, and they got his auditory. They superimpose this, so these two participants are going to see the exact same thing and hear the exact same thing. It's two ghostly images of the faces and two auditory streams. The male and female voices are pretty easy to extract from one another. So one person is told, focus on the female and her story. The other person is told, focus on the male and his story. And sure enough, the EEG recorded from this listener is more correlated with the EEG pattern of that speaker than with that one. They're getting the same stimulus, but that attentional focus on one story is producing a neural activation pattern over time that has correlations with the original speaker. Their brains are getting correlated with one another. Both at a time scale of about a word level, about a half a second or so, there's a spike in correlations, and at about a 2 to 4 second level, maybe a semantic unit of phrases or sentences, they have a spike in that correlation. And even across a few sentences, the biggest spike in neural correlations among the speaker and the listener, right here, is after about 12 seconds, throwing together a few sentences, a little piece of a story has now turned that brain into something that is correlated with the other brain. Daniel Richardson done some work looking at people's eye movements while they're telling a story about their favorite episode of this TV show, Friends. You record their eye movements while they're doing it, and then you bring someone else in the lab, and they look at that same display, just put the headphones on and hear the same story. I'm going to skip over that slide. What you'll find is correlations in the eye movements. People are looking at the same face at around the same time. This peak in recurrence, or kind of correlation of eye movements doing the same thing at almost the same time, at about a second and a half later, essentially the speaker looks at a face, then says the name, then the listener, could be a week later or a year later, they've got their headphones on, they hear that name, then they look at the face. There's your 1 second, 1.5 second lag of those eye movement patterns. Then they were really smart, and they got 2 eye trackers in 2 labs with 2 headsets and 2 people, and they co-create their conversation. This is not a monologue anymore. This is 2 people completing each other's sentences and interrupting each other and sharing a dialogue that they've co-created. And now that lag goes away. They're looking at the same thing at the same time when they talk about some shared image. Brains are getting correlated. Eye movements are getting correlated. There's other work showing that postural sway gets correlated. These external objects that are people are becoming part of the system that you're generating, and you're becoming part of the system that they're generating. Maybe they're part of the physical material that generates whatever consciousness is. Now, many people have made these kinds of claims. I don't have time to walk through a detail of this. This is some samples of people who've suggested a kind of externalist account of whatever mental contents are and maybe what consciousness is. As you expand that scope of back and forth sharing of information between brain areas, it's not that different from the back and forth sharing of information between that brain and the body, which in turn is not that different from the back and forth sharing of information between the body and its environment. If this inner circle is a brain contents and the surrounding one is a body contents, we could talk about where the mental contents are and maybe put a kind of fuzzy logic curve over it, a bell curve that describes the stuff inside the brain is 1.0 true, part of your mental contents, maybe your real consciousness. The stuff that's surrounding that brain and inside the body is probably still 0.7 or 0.8, part of your mental activity, your mental content, maybe your consciousness. And even sometimes some of the things that are outside your body, tools in your hand, people you're talking to, are 0.4 or 5, part of who you are, part of your mental contents. When you're having a conversation with somebody in the hallway, there's some partial overlap between the things in the environment that are part of your consciousness and part of their consciousness. Maybe you're holding hands with a loved one and having a deep conversation. There's quite a bit of overlap in those mental contents. The consciousness is shared. You get a body that walks through a hallway, another body, and they have a shared conversation. Those 2 bodies over time chat for a few minutes, and then they go and have lunch with someone else. The mental contents in that situation is a pattern like this. This is what Vittorio Galeazzi has referred to as a shared manifold of intersubjectivity. Maybe this consciousness that's happening is spreading out enough to have enough overlap with other people and whatever their consciousness is, shared objects, shared discussion topics, that this manifold is the mental contents shared across a group of people, maybe even the consciousness that's shared across a group of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spivey. Dramatic discussion. Thank you. So again, we'll have time for a couple of questions. Again, invoking chair privilege. Your initial discussion makes me think about spinal cord control modules for gait and things like that, so that the conscious brain is sending the signal down that says walk, and then the modules are operating. So walk us back up a little bit. What do you think about what's coming up from higher, and how does that link to your probabilistic discussion here?
Yeah,
There's definitely the case that many brain areas can behave in a somewhat modular fashion. Even frontal cortex and visual cortex and auditory cortex can be a little bit modular in the way that a rhythmic pattern generator can be somewhat modular. But there's interruptions that can be happening all the time. And so when frontal cortex needs, or when the visual cortex or somatosensory cortex needs to interrupt that central pattern generator in the brainstem that's making you do some walking, you should be grateful that it can do that interruption, because otherwise you might bump into something that could hurt you. The modularity that we see in the brain, and neuroscientists are still comfortable using the term modules, because when they say a module, they mean this is something that is partially specialized, but it still is always going to have quite a bit of interactions with neighboring systems. Just about any two brain areas that are connected to each other at all are generally connected bidirectionally, and so they're clearly going to be sharing information in a back and forth most of the time. That doesn't mean that they can't occasionally act in a somewhat modular fashion, but luckily they can be interrupted during their modular processing.
So we have a question over here.
With reference to the experiment where there's selective audio perception between the male and female, and not being a neuroscientist, I asked the question, is there somewhere in the brain which actually does this selection or focus, or have neuroscientists not detected this? It could be something of the mind. If
Yeah,
mind
cognitive neuroscientists have found a number of brain areas that they often will point to as being maybe the source of attentional control. Anterior cingulate is frequently active during attentional tasks. Frontal lobes are frequently active during the attentional guidance of some perceptual task. It's probably not the case that you've got one brain area that all by itself is doing whatever attention is. It's probably a network of areas, and different types of attention, according to a lot of the cognitive neuroscience research, different types of attention may recruit different pieces of that network. And so there will be some, anterior cingulate and frontal cortex will be common usual suspects in whatever network gets active to do this kind of attention or some other kind of attention. But there will be other brain areas that get recruited into that network to generate an attentional control of whatever perceptual task you're looking at.
Question? You got a hand up over there?
Yes.
You can take the microphone.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. I have a couple of questions. One is, do you believe in free will? If the brain knows what we're going to do before we intend to. And then another is that I'm giving a talk, I'm one of the concurrent sessions on language and autism, and I've been working with these nonverbal autistic children who claim to be able to access their mother's mental space. And it made me wonder whether or not there might be kind of like, accessing the parent's mental space as part of the acquisition of language, and then once language is acquired, we lose that ability. And I invite people to attend my talk because I'll show you some data.
Yeah, I think there's a massive amount of communication that takes place relatively non-linguistically. Sometimes it's described as extra-linguistic interactions, gestures, and head nods. I think we're still using them even once we've learned language, but it could be the case that children who haven't yet learned language are using those nonverbal modes of communication especially well, even better than others. In terms of the question of free will, I don't know what exactly free will would be personally. But I'm convinced, especially by John Dylan Haynes' demonstration with fMRI of a Lebet task, that if it's 7 seconds before your seemingly freely willed choice that frontal cortex is producing information that you can use to predict what's going to be done, whatever free will is, it's going to have to somehow fit that data point into it, which would be tricky.
One last quick question.
How serious are you about the intersection of minds? I mean, in this room, for instance, we share many concepts, but most of us will not agree on what consciousness is, for instance, because the inferential distance is too large. When I try to share concepts with you or make it shares anything with you. I make a model of you, and the quality of that model I can measure by how well I can predict your behavior. But I cannot even predict my own behavior. I consistently do things that are very different than I think what I would be doing in that situation, which means I'm mismodeling myself. I don't even share a mind with myself that much. How can I share a mind with you?
Well, I think you almost answered the question yourself. The degree to which your own mind is shared with itself is limited, and therefore the degree to which our shared minds are actually shared is limited. We often think we're communicating on the same thing using terms like free will or consciousness, when each of us may have slightly different definitions or maybe significantly different definitions of what that might be. So the shared mind is something that is definitely an imperfect, it's not a properly defined set of concepts across these minds that is part of the sharing, but that's also true within one mind, it looks like. I think the sharing has to do a lot with correlated patterns of information. And so frontal cortex and visual cortex have correlated patterns of information within a brain that shows this brain operates like one system. And sometimes two separate brains can have shared correlated patterns of information that show they're functioning a little bit like one system.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to help your academic great-grandfather over here to the podium. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Noam Chomsky, who will be speaking about language and unconscious acts.
Well, I'm going to shift gears a little in several respects. For one thing, no technology, so no PowerPoint. Not even a chalk blackboard. And also I'd like to reflect a little about how some of these, the issues that concern us have been shaped and formulated over time. Particularly, I'd like to talk about how thoughts are constructed by the human language faculty, and I will accept the traditional view that the language faculty is indeed the essential property that distinguishes humans from the rest of the animal world. That's a long tradition. I think it now has substantial empirical support. And more specifically, I would like to discuss the something that Tom raised earlier, the deep interpenetration of unconscious and inaccessible mental operations of language with the occasional fragments that reach consciousness, sometimes leading to what we call inner speech, and occasionally, actually very rarely, being externalized into the outer environment. And to set the stage for this, I would like to turn to the origins of the modern scientific revolution, modern science and philosophy in the 17th and 18th century, and to review how these issues were conceived at that time. I think there are actually some useful lessons to be found, including for the general study of consciousness. So in the early days of the modern scientific revolution, Galileo and his contemporaries formulated what seems to me the core issue in the study of mind and the study of language. I'll quote them. They expressed their awe and wonder at the fact that language permits us to construct from 25 or 30 sounds an infinite variety of expressions, which, although not having any resemblance in themselves to that which passes through our minds, nevertheless do not fail to reveal all of the secrets of the mind and to make intelligible to others who cannot penetrate into the mind all that we conceive and all of the diverse movements of our souls. Galileo himself described the invention of the alphabet, which shares these properties, as surpassing all stupendous inventions. That seems to me to capture a core critical problem yet to be addressed in anything near its full richness and complexity. Well, over the years that followed, there is occasional, though very rare, recognition of this challenge, but it was not really until the mid-20th century that intellectual tools were available to address at least parts of the challenge properly. That's thanks to the great mathematicians, Gödel, Turing, others who established the theory of computability on a firm basis. And that made it possible to face at least part of the challenge, namely to determine the rules and the principles by which our finite brains can construct an infinite array of structured thoughts, kind of a language of thought, and sometimes to externalize these thoughts, usually by sound, not necessarily, so that others can gain access to all that we conceive and all of the diverse movements of our souls. That's one part of the traditional concern, but not all. What so impressed the founders of modern science was the normal creative use of these mechanisms. The fact that we regularly construct new expressions intelligible to others, appropriate to novel situations, but not caused by them. Appropriateness and cause are quite different things that we are incited or inclined to produce, but not compelled in Cartesian terminology. And it was recognition of this creative capacity that led Descartes to postulate a thinking substance, res cogitans, alongside of the mechanical principles that accounted for the rest of the phenomena of the world, he argued, including human sensation, perception, emotions, and other qualities. All of this fell within mechanism, but mechanism was incapable of accounting for the creative aspect of language use. This idea had a fate which is not usually understood. The part of the picture collapsed, the rest of it remained. The part that collapsed was mechanism. The part that remained was soul. Newton exorcised the body, but left the soul intact, and so it remains. I'll talk about that a little bit. Today, it's commonly claimed that consciousness is commonly regarded as what's called the hard problem, David Chalmers' phrase. But that was not the way the matter was viewed by the founders of modern science. They did formulate what they considered hard problems. One hard problem was the normal creative aspect of language use that I just mentioned. Another hard problem was the nature of motion. This was the hard rock in science, in the words of Sir William Petty, one of the founders of the Royal Society, and with the agreement of other leading scientists of the day. And actually, the hard rock became even harder after Newton's groundbreaking achievements. Like other major scientists of the day, Leibniz, Christian Huygens, others, Newton regarded his conclusions as, in his words, so great an absurdity that no competent scientist can ever fall into it. And in fact, he spent the rest of his life trying to find some intelligible account of action at a distance. And he agreed that this description of his that the account lay beyond the bounds of sound science as it had been conceived from Galileo through Newton and well beyond, This was the science that displaced neo-scholastic mysticism with the concept of a mechanical universe, a concept that was undermined by Newton, much to his disbelief and dismay. Now, of course, Newton's theories were quite intelligible to the scientists of the day. That was not the problem. The problem was that the theories attributed to the world non-mechanical principles that are inconceivable to us. And accordingly, Newton agreed that he had not been able to produce a physical theory, only mathematical laws that somehow we must accept. That's the title of his great work, is Mathematical Principles, not Physical Principles. David Hume, shortly after, captured the general scientific understanding of the day when he wrote that Newton appeared to draw the veil from some of the mysteries of nature, but showed at the same time the imperfections of the mechanical philosophy, that meant mechanical science, and thereby restored nature's ultimate secrets to that obscurity in which they ever did and ever will remain. And much the same conclusion is expressed by contemporary historians of science. So, for example, Alexander Poiré, who writes that despite his unwillingness to accept the conclusion, Newton had demonstrated that a purely materialistic pattern of nature is utterly unintelligible. His mathematical physics required the admission into the body of science of incomprehensible and inexplicable facts imposed on us by what is observed and our conclusions from these observations. Actually, it's sometimes argued that relativistic and other modern theories of motion and mass overcome these qualms, but in fact they only deepen them. These conceptions depart even farther from mechanical science, making the hard problem even harder from the perspective of science that was developed by its great founders, from Galileo through Newton and beyond. The two main hard problems of early modern science were motion and the creative aspect of language use. And neither problem has been solved. In fact, both have been pretty much abandoned and by now are scarcely even recognized. With regard to mechanical science, science simply abandoned it. It lowered its goals from seeking an intelligible world to seeking intelligible theories of the world, like Newton's. And with regard to the creative aspect of language use, if we can borrow Humboldt's aphorism that language involves infinite use of finite means, we have in very recent years learned a great deal about the means, but the normal creative use of these means remains another of Hume's mysteries. So there were two major hard problems. Both have been abandoned, pretty much shelved. They're too hard for us to deal with. They are permanent mysteries for us as Hume described it. Consciousness was discussed in this period, though not very much. The concept of consciousness did not become a major concern of inquiry until the early 18th century, and then with a focus that's very different from the modern one. I'll just quote the major scholarly inquiry into the topic by Hugo Thiel. He points out that consciousness was understood as a way of relating to one's own mental states. It was an inner-directed sense of consciousness that dominated 18th century discussions in Britain and the continent, not awareness of qualia, but awareness of what's going on inside your mind. And that, in fact, had been Descartes' conception in the Meditations. Here, conscious knowledge of one's existence is fundamental, based on immediate awareness of our own thinking activity, and knowledge of the external world is derivative, a harder problem than consciousness. And as Hume supposed, it might even involve permanent mysteries for humans. It would not be terribly surprising if humans are in fact organic creatures, not angels, and hence with scope and limits of capacities, including cognitive capacities. So in short, the two hard problems of the 17th and 18th century remain unsolved, in fact, abandoned as science lowered its sights. But consciousness, understood as directed to our intermental states, was not then considered a particularly hard problem. Rather, it was the starting point for inquiry. And pretty much the same stand was adopted by Bertrand Russell in one of his most important essays, Analysis of Matter, 90 years ago. Russell adopted the Humean view that, his words, the highest grade of certainty belongs to my own percepts, what I immediately am conscious of. That's the highest grade of certainty. And we can then think of the constructions of the mind as efforts to make sense of what we immediately are aware of, immediately perceive. This is true. Far as revealing what he called the causal structure of nature, leaving other matters a mystery for us. And the natural conclusion from the 18th century collapse of mechanical science was drawn by scientists at the time, including, for example, the 18th century chemist Joseph Black. He recommended that for chemistry, a chemical affinity be received as a first principle, which we cannot explain any more than Newton could explain gravitation. And let us then proceed to developing such a body of doctrine as Newton has established concerning the laws of gravitation. And that, if you look at the history, is pretty much the way chemistry developed. And it's a model for the developing sciences generally. Seek to construct a body of doctrine, even if some of the fundamentals appear completely mysterious. And one task for this body of doctrine is to incorporate our own percepts, our highest degree of certainty. And how far this can be achieved, we cannot know in advance. Perhaps not very far if Russell's conception of the bounds of scientific understanding is anywhere near correct, a conception shared with Eddington and other leading scientists. Well, in the same essay, Russell posed a thought experiment that's become quite famous in a somewhat different version presented by Frank Jackson. Russell and Jackson later consider a blind physicist who's called Mary in the literature. So Mary, the blind physicist, knows all of science, but not what it is like to see something red. That's the conundrum. And the conundrum presupposes that science does not account for what it is like to see something red, which is the question under discussion. And if science does reach that far, then Mary, in fact, did not know all of science. The force of the conundrum is supposed to be that we cannot conceive of how conscious experience can be derived from properties of the brain. Thomas Nagel's put it clearly in many influential essays. He says, we can see how liquidity is the logical result of molecules rolling around on each other at the microscopic level, though nothing comparable is to be expected in the case of the brain and consciousness. We cannot see how subjective experience can be the logical result of properties of the brain. It is not conceivable to us. That's the conundrum. And there are a number of problems. One is that the notion of conceivability has not had a happy fate in the history of science. It was abandoned centuries ago after Newton's discoveries. To Newton, Leibniz, Locke, Huygens, Hume, others who pondered the problems, it was inconceivable that matter and motion can have the properties that they do have. Today, we share their intuitive capacities, but we've abandoned the notion, the concept of psychological conceivability. And that's understood by historians of science. Historian of materialism, Friedrich Lange, pointed out that by accustoming ourselves to these ideas over time, we have departed from the great mathematicians and physicists who founded modern science. They were genuine materialists who made immediate contact a condition of influence, and the abandonment of genuine materialism of mechanical science was one of the most important turning points in the whole history of materialism, depriving the doctrine of much significance, if any at all. So conceivability to us is just a feature of our cognitive nature. We learned long ago that these considerations must be abandoned in the scientific quest for understanding. As Russell put it in the same essay, the very idea of an intelligible world is absurd. He repeatedly places the word intelligible in quotes to highlight the absurdity of the quest, dismissing qualms about conceivability as little more than a prejudice. Modern science, from Galileo through Newton, was indeed based on the widely held idea that Nagel expressed. So the founders of modern science did hold that we should be able to see how conclusions about the world follow from the intuitively compelling assumption that the world is a machine, just a complex version of the intricate automata that were constructed everywhere in those days by skilled artisans. So Galileo, for example, rejected traditional theories of tides because, as he put it, we cannot duplicate them by means of appropriate artificial devices, physical machines, which is a necessary condition for intelligibility. And I think a plausible case can be made that this mechanical conception does capture our intuitive sense of how the world must work, which is why the great figures who founded modern science adopted this conception as soon as they abandoned neo-scholastic occult ideas, and why they took it as the very criterion of intelligibility and legitimate explanation. But those days are long gone and should not be evoked in addressing the questions that concern us now, like consciousness. So that leaves the problems unsolved, but it suggests that to approach them, we should follow Joseph Black's advice, seek to follow, to find the operative principles, whether they yield is whether or not what they yield is conceivable to us, not a relevant consideration. And in the case of consciousness, it seems to me wise to take seriously the viewpoint of early modern science and to attend carefully, maybe even primarily, as they did, to consciousness of our inner mental states, our inner mental life, the way we construct thoughts and sometimes express them. And when we turn to this question, there are some real surprises. So take, for example, the simple sentence. The examples I use will be simple enough, so won't need any visual presentations. But take the very simple sentence, which book did John read? It has a sound and an interpretation as a thought. Now, there happens to be very strong evidence that the internal mental operations that generate the thought are self-contained and independent of the operations that map the internal structured object to the sensory motor system. This externalization process is ancillary, does not enter into the generation of the thought. So in the case of the sentence, which book did John read? The thought that's generated in the mind has no linear order of words. And in fact, there are two occurrences of the phrase, which book? One of them in the position in which you hear it, one of them in the same position as the book, and John read the book. So what's reaching the mind is something like the abstract hierarchical structure, which book John read which book, has no linear ordering. It's just an abstract hierarchical structure, and it's interpreted directly as the thought for which book X John read book X. Just read that off the thing that's in the mind. And very simple examples illustrate that linear order is simply ignored in computation of the thoughts. So consider these two sentences. The first sentence, it is his mother that every person seems to admire. The second sentence, it is his mother that seems to admire every person. And ask yourself about the relation between every person and he, the variable he. So in both cases, the pronoun he, his, precedes the quantifier every, but only in the first case can the pronoun be interpreted as a variable within the scope of the quantifier. So the first one, it is his mother that every person that seems to admire, means that for every person X seems to admire, X seems to admire X's mother. The second sentence can't have that interpretation. The reason is that what reaches the mind, but not the ear, is an abstract, unordered structure with two copies of the phrase, his mother, in one case with the phrase in the normal position of quantification, every person seems to admire his mother, in the other case in a structure where quantifier variable relations don't hold, his mother seems to admire every person. And more complex expressions work the same way, yielding often quite subtle semantic interpretations, of course, all instantaneously. And it's worth bearing in mind that it's a rather puzzling and surprising fact that linear order is never used in the internal computations that create the language of thought. The reason is that linear computations are the simplest ones. In terms of complexity of computation, there's nothing simpler than looking at adjacent things or linearly close things and so on. Structural distance, which is universally used in internal computations, is a much more complex operation. And the puzzle is, why does language use only structural relations, structural distance, it's called structure dependence, and never the simpler linear observations? There is now a very good explanation for that. In fact, it kind of follows from the null hypothesis about simple computation. I'll say a couple of words about it. But it is an interesting puzzle which should have bothered people more than it has. Well, externalization, say in speech, does impose linear order. and it deletes the copy, one of the copies, actually the one that's lower in the hierarchical structure. Linear order is imposed for a simple reason. The articulatory system requires it. You can't speak structures. You can't speak in parallel. So whatever's going on in the mind has to be linearized to come out of the mouth. And in fact, in sign, which is a somewhat different modality, you can use other aspects of the visual system to overcome strict linear order. But it's all part of the sensory motor system, has nothing to do with language. Of the two, and in fact in more complicated cases, very many copies, only one remains, and that follows from principles of efficient computation, which apply to language, rather in the way that principles of physics determine that a cell divides into spheres. You don't have to there's some genetic elements involved, but you don't have to have a genetic program that says divide into spheres. That comes from physics. And similarly, deletion of the copies comes from efficient computation, which is pretty much a law of nature as far as computational systems are concerned. Well, importantly, these and many other consequences follow from the null hypothesis that the computational system that generates the language of thought is optimal or close to it, which is a conclusion that conforms quite well to what's known about evolution of language. There's no time here to go into all of this, but I think it's reasonably well established. The sensory motor systems evolved long before language did. In the case of the articulatory system, hundreds of thousands of years before. In the case of the gestural system used in sign, millions of years before. And these systems are completely unrelated to language. Externalization establishes a connection between two unrelated systems, an internal, possibly near optimal system of computation that yields the language of thought, and sensory motor systems that had been around long before. So it's not surprising that as we discover the variety, the apparent complexity, the easy mutability of what we informally call language resides overwhelmingly in the process of externalization. The internal linguistic system that generates the language of thought may be close to uniform or even uniform among humans, hence not learned, just sitting there, mainly following from principles of efficient computation. And it's likely that this internal system, if learned at all, is learned in only peripheral aspects, much as in the case of growth and development generally. So the fact that an embryo is going to grow arms, not wings, is fixed in advance, but the exact length of the arms will depend on peripheral phenomena. And that seems to be true of internal language as well. In fact, what are called languages in our ordinary standard usage are not really languages at all. They are rather complex interactions between language and independent non-linguistic systems that are used for externalization. The articulatory system for speech, vision and gesture for sign. Note that the externalized expression, which book did John read, actually poses some problems for communication, problems that become quite serious in more complex sentences. So one of the hardest problems for automatic parsing and also for perception is to locate the position of the gap that's left by deletion of the copy. That problem becomes quite severe as soon as sentences become moderately complex. And this is one illustration of a crucial fact about language. whenever there's a conflict between computational efficiency and communicative efficiency, the latter is sacrificed. So in brief, it means that contrary to much contemporary doctrine, language is optimally designed, structured for generation of thought, with communication only a marginal aspect of our linguistic and mental systems. This has bearing on the question of evolution of language. Won't go into that. Well, there's no time here to run through the evidence. It, in fact, converges from many directions, from linguistics, psycholinguistics, neurolinguistics, evolutionary biology. But it does seem to me substantial and has some interesting implications for the study of consciousness. I'm now keeping to the traditional focus of consciousness on the inner workings of the mind. So let's consider what's called inner speech, talking to oneself, something we do constantly all the time. Can't stop doing it. So when we say to ourselves, which book did John read? Notice that we have linear order and copy deletion. We don't have the abstract underlying structure that yields the thought, the one with two copies and no linear order, and that's universal. The mental computations of the internal language that produce the thought are completely unconscious and inaccessible to consciousness. No awareness of them at all. What reaches consciousness in inner speech is something that's quite superficial, and that in fact is not language, but rather an amalgam of language and the sensory motor system, two unrelated systems, as I discussed. So even in the case of inner speech, inaccessible, unconscious mental acts are inextricably intertwined with the superficial phenomenon that reaches consciousness. And if you think about it a little further, introspect more closely, I think you'll see that what reaches consciousness is actually just fragments, bits and pieces, which we can, by an act of will, use to construct a full linguistic expression. In fact, pretty much aware at the outset, when you start to form this in your mind, you're pretty well aware of how it's going to turn out at the end. It's all somehow sitting there, waiting to be formed in inner speech as a reflection of externalization. Furthermore, all of this happens almost instantaneously, although quite intricate mental computational operations are taking place. Tom discussed some of them before. They become quite complex if you look at moderately complex sentences, which we construct, as far as we're aware, instantaneously from fragments that occasionally reach consciousness. And you can see this even more dramatically in normal life situations. So suppose, say, that you walk into a room, you see John sitting there, you remember that you wanted to tell John about something, but then you happen to notice that Bill is there too, and Bill would be offended if you spoke to John in the way you intended to. So instead you say something else, something more neutral. All of this happens almost instantaneously. Extensive linguistic computation is taking place right throughout, all intertwined inextricably with the bits and pieces, the tiny fragments that reach consciousness. These are all matters that have to be taken account of in the study of the phenomenology of conscious awareness of our internal mental states. And again, I think that's a proper focus for the study of consciousness for traditional reasons. And all of that is a preliminary to the scientific inquiry, the quite intriguing scientific inquiry of which you here a good bit here, as to how these operations are rooted in the functioning of the brain. These impose conditions and constraints, as Tom mentioned earlier, on how this inquiry should proceed. And the general picture is indeed somewhat reminiscent of the Libet experiments that Michael mentioned a couple of minutes ago. The action is initiated several hundred milliseconds before it reaches consciousness. In the case of language, just fragments reach consciousness, which are sometimes converted into internalized inner speech, internalized from the external system, occasionally externalized as sound and sign. And there do seem to be feasible ways to investigate these topics. Tom mentioned a number of them earlier, even with contemporary technology and experimental techniques. And pursuing them might, I think, shed considerable light on the nature of conscious awareness and its intricate linkages with deeper processes that are constantly taking place in our minds as we construct our thoughts and as we try to interpret the thoughts of others. And this interpenetration appears to be a central part of the phenomenology of consciousness, hence a topic to be addressed and considered carefully in constructing a body of doctrine about the nature of consciousness and ultimately its roots. Thanks. If there are any questions you want to interpret them for others, I will. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. Again, I will invoke the chair privilege, and in fact, your last few comments are really the aspiration of hope that with technology and theory, we may have access to understanding these inner thoughts. And these inner processes. And so as we are here and pointed out that your graduate student and his graduate student's graduate student are here, if you were to be advising a new PhD student, do you have hope and sound feelings that they would be able to study these things and really come up with productive things rather than just descriptive ontologies, but what's really going on in our inner thoughts? Is that a valid area for research?
Well, it is, but I would put it a little differently. I suspect that what's really going on probably will remain a mystery for humans, just as the hard problems of early modern science were mysteries that were abandoned. Now, that doesn't mean we can't learn a lot. After abandoning the search for intelligibility of the world, after abandoning mechanical science, physics made huge steps forward, just in a different direction. And I suspect that that's a lesson for us to bear in mind. I think there's a lot of possibility of learning about the means that are used. What are the formal mechanisms that are used in constructing the internal system, which is the authentic language, the kind that we have no access to through introspection. But what's going on there? There's huge challenges. So, for example, just the simple point that I mentioned, showing that in fact a linear order and other arrangements never enter into the construction of the infinite array of thoughts, what struck the early founders of modern science with such awe and wonder. Just showing that alone is an enormous challenge. The whole 2,500-year history of the study of language has taken the opposite for granted. So all the work that's been done for a couple of thousand years takes for granted that things like linear order enter directly into the construction of the internal system, but seems to be wrong. And if it's wrong, there's a huge topic to be addressed and investigated to show that what's been assumed for 2,500 years descriptively has a different interpretation entirely without any linear order and also some of these other differences that I mentioned. The next question, which you're raising, is with contemporary technology, can we figure out what the brain is doing? Well, I think we can. The field is ripe to find lots of things that the brain is actually doing while this is going on. But then to get to a deeper understanding of, what we might like to comprehend, maybe we can, maybe we can't. We are organic creatures. We are not angels. We have capacities. They yield scope. There's all kinds of things we can do, but just by logic, that imposes limits. We don't know how these limits relate to the truth about the world. We have some examples where they don't, as Newton, Hume, and others showed, but we don't know here. So you just keep going ahead.
So there's hope for PhD students out there yet.
Plenty.
Very good. Well, we have time for just a couple of questions. And if you could, if you speak your question, I will relay it to Professor Chomsky.
Okay. Hello. As I understand, right, you tell us that some unconscious process could not be accessible by conscious. If it's true, how can you prove it? Maybe just you don't discover the access, but someone else could find it.
So if I got about half. Yeah.
Are there unconscious processes that are not accessible by consciousness? How can we prove them? How can we find them? Is there an opportunity to detect them?
Sure. I mean, most of what goes on in the world we're not aware of. What's happening at the level of atoms and particles and so on, we don't have any consciousness of, but we learn about it. And here, too, you can learn about it. In fact, I gave a couple of examples. So just take those two sentences that I gave that had a quantifier and a variable. In one case, the quantifier ranges over the variable. In the other case, it doesn't, even though the linear order is the same. All right, that tells us right off that linear order doesn't seem to be involved. Or take something as trivial as a subject-verb agreement, most trivial thing you can imagine. So a sentence like, John and Mary are here, but not John and Mary is here. Why? Actually, if you take a look at the Google processor, it gives you the opposite result. And the reason is very simple.
What is unconscious about that?
Pardon?
Where is unconscious?
Mary has a much higher bigram frequency than Mary are. And in fact, if you look at the statistics of the linear sequence, it gives you the opposite conclusion. And there's basically no way around this if you think about slightly more complex sentences. You simply have to introduce the notion of a phrase of higher structure and recognize that that's the one that enters into a determining agreement. And this is all over the place. So lots of languages have a phenomenon that's called V second. The verb comes in the second position. English has a kind of a limited residue of it in things like what will John do, but other languages all over the place. But notice that verb second doesn't mean second word in the sentence. It means the second position in the sentence after the first structure. And everywhere you look in language, this is universal. So what do you conclude? Well, you conclude that there's something about the internal computational operations that ignores order. And in fact, when you go a step further and you ask, what is the optimal computational system, the one that would arise in evolutionary history if there were no external forces operating, which is probably what happened. And it turns out that that simplest computational operation doesn't have linear order. Okay, so we have a far-reaching explanation for a wide range of very puzzling phenomena. That's the way all of science works. It doesn't ask, are we conscious of what's going on in there? Most of the time we're not, including our own minds.
One more question.
Yes. I wanted to point out that I resonated with what you said about the comments of how difficult it is to go from complex thought to what actually takes place and to the linear arrangement of words on the page. And I thought immediately, this is why we need editors. This is why we make multiple drafts as scientists. But it's also because we remain isolated in disciplines. I've been involved in the space program since day one. And when Dr. Spivey gave an amazing presentation about shared mind and shared destination, or how global can we be, we have living examples of that. And instead of his showing the monkey reaching for something, he could show the guys who were involved in sending a robot to Mars. And in their excitement, they had this aha moment that said, we have an extension of ourselves on Mars. Now that is consciousness. And it wasn't hard to explain that because it was video and you were there in the moment because it was part of a documentary. With that in mind, let's also think about the fact that we talk to each other in scientific disciplines. I came up working as a biologist with a physical chemist and a physicist. And then being in the space program, I had to think cosmic and global. And this is where we are. And this is shared mind. And we are not tapping into that to the extent that we could. And I really am encouraged by what you had to say about where we have been, because I'm in the history and philosophy of science now at the University of Cambridge after having been at Baylor College of Medicine. And so there, I'm not only in the past 800 years, but very much in the future, which is where Cambridge is, and we're all about action. And all of that has been touched on in so many ways. So I'd love for your thoughts on, how far we've come already. You said, yes, we've abandoned some things, but we're taking them back up, I think, in the space program, and it's not appreciated. It's not widely known.
I got some of it, but not all. Yeah.
So if I might paraphrase.
Yeah.
She is commenting on the extension of consciousness and our minds through tools, and pointing out that our tools have reached other planets and in fact now even beyond the solar system, and that's really an extension of our thinking. And she would thought of what do you think of this dramatic extension of embodied cognition?
Well, we're learning more about space. We're learning more about our brains. Modern contemporary technology is, in fact, giving considerable insight into a lot of the things that are going on in our brains. It's telling us something about, what's happening in outer space. It's telling us that the universe is expanding. It's giving some ideas about the origins of the universe. As we heard yesterday, what might have happened before the Big Bang and why it'll go on infinitely and so on. That's all more information to try to assimilate, to account for, to explain, to try to find good theoretical formulations that provide not just prediction but also understanding of what all this is about. That's the intellectual enterprise of modern science and inquiry. Actually goes way back, but takes off with an inflection point at about the 17th century, and that's what we're part of. Actually, Alfred North Whitehead once said that we're all living off the intellectual capital accumulated by the genius of the 17th century. And I think there's a fair amount of truth to that. There's a lot of intellectual capital there still to be explored. I mentioned some of it. There's new vistas of knowledge and understanding and data, strange data, much of it unexplained in every domain, that offers challenges to inquiry, and that's where we proceed.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. So we'll declare this session closed.